Morning broke over Guadalcanal on January 22, 1943. Second Lieutenant John George, just 27 years old, positioned himself in the shattered remains of a Japanese strongpoint near Point Cruz. Through his rifle scope, the one his comrades had ridiculed for 6 solid weeks, he surveyed a massive banyan tree standing 240 yards distant. George was Illinois' youngest ever state shooting champion. Yet despite his credentials, he had 0 enemy kills to his name. Meanwhile, Japanese sharpshooters, 11 of them, were systematically picking off American soldiers in the coastal groves. In just 3 days, 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment had fallen to invisible bullets from the canopy. Here's where it gets interesting. George's commanding officer had dismissed his rifle as a toy. Fellow platoon leaders mockingly called it his mail-order sweetheart. When he'd first unpacked the Winchester Model 70 with its Lyman Alaskan scope at Camp Forest, Tennessee, even the armorer questioned whether this civilian hunting rifle was meant for deer or Germans. George explained his target would be Japanese soldiers, but the rifle never made it to the ship. While other soldiers cleaned their standard-issue M1 Garands during the Pacific crossing, George's prized Winchester sat in an Illinois warehouse. He filed paperwork to have it forwarded. 6 weeks passed. Then, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a crate stamped fragile. The numbers tell the story. George's Winchester weighed 9 pounds. Add the scope, and you're looking at 9 pounds, 12 ounces total. The M1 Garand that every other soldier carried, 9.5 pounds with no magnification whatsoever. George's rifle held 5 rounds and required manual bolt operation between shots. The Garand? Semi-automatic with 8-round capacity. Captain Morris ordered George to ditch the sporting rifle and carry proper military equipment. George carried it anyway, and that decision would change everything. The 132nd had taken over from battle-weary Marines who'd been fighting since August. Henderson Field was secured, but Mount Austin, standing 1,514 feet tall and defended by 500 Japanese soldiers in 47 fortified bunkers, remained in enemy hands. George's battalion assaulted the position on December 17th. 16 brutal days followed, 34 Americans killed, 279 wounded, before they finally captured the western slopes on January 2nd. Throughout that entire bloodbath, George's Winchester remained silent. 0 combat shots fired. The coastal jungle near Point Cruz presented different challenges. No concrete bunkers. No permanent defensive positions. Just Japanese soldiers who'd retreated westward, melting into the enormous trees. Some of these men were elite snipers with scoped Arisaka Type 98 rifles. They understood the jungle intimately. They possessed the patience to wait for hours without moving. January 19th. Corporal Davis shot dead while filling canteens at a creek. January 20th. 2 men from L Company killed during routine patrol. January 21st. 3 more Americans dead. 1 soldier took a round through the neck from a tree his patrol had already passed twice. That evening, the battalion commander summoned George. Japanese snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could actually shoot. Could that mail-order rifle hit anything? George laid out his qualifications. Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards in 1939. At age 23, he'd been the youngest winner in state history. 6-inch groupings at 600 yards using only iron sights. With the Lyman Alaskan scope, 5 consecutive rounds within a 4-inch circle at 300 yards. The commander gave George until sunrise to prove it. If you want to discover how this civilian hunting rifle performed against professionally trained jungle warfare snipers, hit that like button. It helps us rescue more forgotten stories from history's Dust Bowl. Dawn, January 22nd. George occupied the captured Japanese bunker overlooking coconut groves west of Point Cruz. Intelligence reported enemy snipers operating from the massive trees in that sector. banyan trees reaching 90 feet skyward with trunks 8 feet thick. A skilled marksman could climb one before sunrise and remain invisible throughout the day. George brought no spotter, no radio operator, just his Winchester, one canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled into position and began systematically glassing the trees. The Lyman Alaskan offered 2.5x magnification, modest by modern standards, but enough to detect movement invisible to the naked eye. Jungle sounds never ceased. Birds calling, insects humming, distant artillery rumbling. George learned to filter the noise, focusing exclusively on movement patterns. At 9:17 a.m., he spotted it. A branch shifted. No wind. Just a subtle displacement, 87 feet up in a banyan tree 240 yards distant. George watched. The branch moved again. Then the shape resolved. A man in dark clothing, positioned where 3 branches forked together. The Japanese sniper faced eastward, observing the trail where American supply columns had been moving. George made his adjustments. 2 clicks right for wind compensation. Breathing controlled. The Winchester's trigger, glass smooth at 3.5 pounds of pressure, had been meticulously adjusted at Camp Perry before the war. Now he'd discover whether a civilian target rifle could kill a man trained to kill him first. The trigger broke. The Winchester recoiled against his shoulder. The sharp report cracked through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked violently and fell. His body tumbled through branches, plummeting 90 feet before striking the ground near the banyan's base. George cycled the bolt. The empty brass ejected, a fresh round chambered. He maintained scope focus on the tree, waiting. Nothing moved. But George knew better. Japanese snipers operated in pairs. 1 shooter, 1 spotter. If he'd just eliminated the shooter, the spotter lurked somewhere nearby, in that tree or the surrounding canopy. George methodically scanned adjacent banyans. The 2.5x magnification forced patience. Each tree could conceal multiple positions. The jungle canopy created shadow patterns that rendered shapes indistinguishable without careful observation. At 9:43 a.m., he located the second sniper. Different tree, 60 yards north of the first. This one positioned lower, approximately 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was descending, retreating. He'd heard the shot and understood his position was compromised. George led the moving target and fired. The second sniper fell backward from the trunk. His rifle clattered through branches ahead of his body. Both hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded from a stripper clip, hands steady, breathing controlled. This felt no different than competition shooting at Camp Perry, except these targets returned fire. At 11:21 a.m., a Japanese bullet impacted the sandbag 6 inches from George's head, spraying dirt into his face. He rolled left and pressed against the bunker wall. The shot originated from the southwest, a different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 full minutes before moving. He carefully repositioned and glassed the southwestern trees. The shooter would have relocated after firing. Standard sniper doctrine: shoot and move. But in jungle, this dense relocation options were limited. He found the third sniper at 11:38 a.m. Third tree from the left, in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up. The Japanese marksman had shifted to a different branch, but remained in the same tree. A fatal mistake. George placed the crosshairs on the dark silhouette and squeezed. The third sniper fell silently. By noon, George had eliminated 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion. Men who'd mocked his mail-order sweetheart now asked to observe his work. George refused. Spectators attracted attention. Attention drew fire. The Japanese adapted after the 5th kill. They stopped all daytime movement. George spent the afternoon glassing empty trees. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris waited. The mockery had vanished from his voice. He wanted George back in position at dawn. Want to know how many more enemy snipers fell to this civilian rifle? Keep watching. The hunt is just beginning. January 23rd opened with torrential tropical rain that transformed the jungle floor into mud and reduced visibility beyond 100 yards to zero. George sat in the bunker, waiting. The rain ceased at 8:15 a.m. By 8:45, sufficient visibility returned for operations. George spotted his first target at 9:12 a.m. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the downpour. Smart. Rain masked movement sounds. This sniper selected a tree 290 yards out. Longer range than yesterday's engagements. Also smart. They were learning his capabilities. George compensated for increased distance and fired. The sniper fell. 6th kill. The response came swift and unexpected. At 9:57 a.m., Japanese mortar rounds began hammering the area around his bunker. They'd triangulated his position from muzzle flash or sound signature. First salvo landed 40 yards short. Second salvo, 20 yards short. The third would obliterate the bunker. George grabbed his Winchester and sprinted north along the tree line, diving into a shell crater as the third salvo struck. The bunker he'd occupied moments earlier disintegrated in explosions and flying debris. He relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed position. The massive trunk provided cover and clear sight lines into the groves. George settled in and resumed his watch. The Japanese sent additional snipers that afternoon. They understood George was hunting them. Now they were hunting him back. The dynamic had shifted. This was no longer target practice. This was a duel. At 2:23 p.m., 7th kill. At 3:41 p.m., 8th kill. This sniper had climbed 94 feet up a banyan. Excellent concealment, but the height created a distinct silhouette against sky when the sun angle changed. At 5 UR p.m., Captain Morris sent a runner to retrieve George. He'd been in position 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days. 12 rounds fired. 8 hits, 4 misses. Morris assigned George to continue sniper operations starting at dawn January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and considered the mathematics. 11 Japanese snipers had been operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 now dead, 3 remaining. Those final 3 would be the elite survivors, the ones who'd outlasted everyone else. And now they knew exactly what George looked like and exactly what rifle he carried. George loaded 5 fresh rounds and attempted sleep. At 3 a.m., he abandoned the effort and sat in his tent with the rifle across his lap. Rain started again at 4:15 a.m. By 5:30, it was heavy enough to delay dawn operations. George used the time to relocate to an entirely new position. Not the bunker, not the fallen tree. Somewhere unexpected. He selected a cluster of large rocks 70 yards south of his previous position, an old Marine machine gun nest from December. The position offered solid cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He settled in and waited for the rain to stop. The deadliest part of the hunt was about to begin. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. These forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered worldwide. At 7:43 a.m., the rain diminished to drizzle. Visibility improved. George began scanning trees. At 8:17 a.m. on January 24th, he located sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier occupied a palm tree 190 yards out. Low position, only 40 feet up. Unusual. Most snipers climbed high for superior sight lines. This one had chosen concealment over elevation. The palm fronds created a natural hide invisible from ground level. But George occupied elevated rocks. The angle allowed him to see down into the fronds. He could distinguish the dark shape of shoulders and head. George aimed, controlled his breathing, began applying trigger pressure, then stopped. Something felt wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy. George had been hunting snipers for 3 days. He'd eliminated 8 men. The remaining 3 wouldn't make elementary mistakes. They wouldn't position themselves where an elevated shooter could spot them, unless it was bait. George lowered his rifle and scanned surrounding trees. If the palm tree sniper was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone taking the shot, waiting for muzzle flash, ready to return fire. George glassed methodically, left to right, top to bottom, every tree within 300 yards of the palm. 11 minutes passed. At 8:28 a.m., he found the real threat. A banyan tree, 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The Japanese sniper occupied a perfect hide, branches and vines concealing him from 3 sides. He maintained clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear there or to shoot at the bait in the palm. George faced 2 problems. First, the real sniper was watching the wrong location. If George engaged him, the sound would reveal George's actual position. The sniper would relocate before George could cycle the bolt and chamber another round. Second, if George did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George wasn't at the fallen tree and begin searching. George decided to turn the bait against them. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm tree, adjusted for wind, fired. The decoy jerked and fell from the palm. George immediately swung his rifle toward the banyan 91 feet up. The real sniper would react to the shot. He'd turn toward the sound. That turn would create movement. George saw it. A slight shift. The sniper was repositioning to face George's location. George placed the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the sniper could fully rotate. The real sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. But George had revealed his position to anyone else watching. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran, moving east along the rock line before dropping into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He pressed himself into mud and waited. At 8:34 a.m., Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he'd been positioned 6 seconds earlier. Bullets kicked up dust and stone fragments. The fire lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, George counted to 60 before moving. He relocated again, this time to a position 100 yards east, a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. George settled into the crater, with water reaching his chest. He rested the Winchester on the crater rim and resumed glassing trees. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The 11th sniper would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. He'd watched 10 comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics. He knew George's rifle. He knew George's approximate location. And somewhere in those trees, he was watching, waiting, planning. This is where the hunt becomes a chess match between 2 masters. Stay with us. George scanned the jungle through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan magnification made distant shapes visible, but not necessarily identifiable. Every dark spot could be a branch, or a man. George had to study each one carefully. At 9:47 a.m., he realized his error. The 11th sniper wasn't in the trees. He was on the ground, moving toward George's position. George caught the movement at the edge of his peripheral vision. 60 yards south, low to the ground. A shape moving through undergrowth parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper was using jungle floor vegetation for cover. Ferns, vines, fallen branches. He was crawling toward George's last known position at the rocks. George remained motionless in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was already shouldered. His breathing was controlled. But the angle was wrong. The crater rim blocked his view of the approaching sniper. To get a clear shot, George would have to rise up. Rising up would expose him. The Japanese sniper stopped at 9:52 a.m. He'd reached a position 40 yards from the rocks, studying them, searching for movement, for any sign of his target. George waited. Patience was the fundamental skill of sniper work, the ability to remain still, to let time pass, to wait for the perfect moment rather than force a bad shot. At 9:58 a.m., the Japanese sniper resumed movement. He crawled forward, 35 yards from the rocks. 30 yards. 25 yards. He was approaching from the south side, the side George had used when evacuating under machine gun fire. George understood the tactic. The Japanese sniper had observed the machine gun attack. He knew George had moved east from the rocks. He was now working his way along the most likely escape route, hunting George the way George had been hunting him. At 10:03 a.m., the Japanese sniper reached the rocks. He moved into the machine gun nest and took position facing east, toward the drainage ditch, toward the area where George should have relocated. The sniper was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, but he was facing the wrong direction. His back was exposed. George had a clear shot, center mass, 38 yards, an easy shot even without magnification. But George hesitated. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz groves. He'd outlived 10 other snipers, men who'd been killed because they made mistakes. This man wouldn't make mistakes. The position in the rocks was too exposed, too vulnerable. No experienced sniper would remain there beyond a few seconds. This had to be another decoy, another bait position. George maintained scope focus on the sniper in the rocks, but expanded his awareness to the surrounding area. If this was bait, the real threat would be positioned to cover it, somewhere with line of sight to anyone taking the shot. At 10:06 a.m., George found it. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier wasn't moving, wasn't repositioning, just watching, waiting. His rifle aimed toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. 2 men, not one. The 11th sniper had brought support. Or perhaps these were the final 2 snipers, numbers 10 and 11, working together. George made his decision. He couldn't engage both men before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required working the action between shots, giving them time to locate him and return fire. He needed a different approach. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water, submerging until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed skyward to prevent water entering the barrel. Then he waited. At 10:13 a.m., the Japanese soldier in the rock stood up. He'd spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seen nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both men began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart. They were executing a sweep, planning to flush George out or locate his position. George remained in the water, motionless. The 2 Japanese soldiers moved past his crater. They were now between George and the tree line. Their backs were exposed. George rose from the water, slowly, silently. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder. Water dripped from the barrel, from his uniform, from his face. He aimed at the closer soldier, the one who'd been in the rocks, now 42 yards away. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, swung the rifle toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The man was turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. But as George climbed from the crater and retrieved his spent cartridges, he heard something that made him freeze. Voices. Japanese voices. Coming from the tree line. Multiple men moving toward the fallen soldiers. This story is far from over. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You need to know what happens next. George had eliminated the snipers, But the snipers hadn't been working alone. George dropped back into the crater. The water was cold, muddy. He submerged until only his eyes remained above the surface, holding the Winchester vertically to keep the barrel clear. The Japanese voices grew louder. At least 6 men, maybe more, moving toward the 2 dead snipers. George heard branches breaking, equipment rattling. These weren't snipers. Infantry. A patrol or recovery team sent to collect bodies. George counted seconds. The voices stopped at the location of the first body, 42 yards from his crater, close enough to hear them clearly without understanding the words. Then the voices moved to the second body. More conversation. Urgent tones. At 10:28 a.m., the voices began moving again. Not back toward the tree line, toward George's crater. They'd found his tracks. Boot prints in mud leading from the rocks to the crater. George had been meticulous about noise and movement. He hadn't been careful about tracks. George had 5 rounds in the Winchester. 6 Japanese soldiers minimum. Poor odds for a bolt-action rifle. He considered his options. Stay hidden and hope they passed, or fight. The voices closed in. 30 yards, 25 yards, 20 yards. At 10:31 a.m., a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim, looking down directly at George. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged, chambered another round, rose up. 2 more soldiers were at the crater rim. George fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both soldiers dropped. 3 rounds left. George could hear shouting. More soldiers moving toward him. He climbed from the crater on the north side, away from the approaching voices, and ran 20 yards before dropping behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets struck ground around the crater, around the fallen tree. The soldiers were firing at movement, at sound, not at confirmed targets. George stayed low. He glassed the area through his scope. Saw movement. 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater, 50 yards out. George aimed at the lead soldier, fired. The soldier dropped. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds left. George heard more voices behind him. The Japanese were flanking. 1 group approaching from the south, another from the east. George was about to be surrounded. He made his decision. He couldn't win a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers with semi-automatic weapons. He needed to break contact, move back toward American lines. George grabbed his rifle and ran north, sprinting through jungle undergrowth. Vines caught his boots. Branches whipped his face. Japanese rifle fire followed him. Bullets snapped past, struck trees, kicked up dirt. George ran for 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed against the crater wall and listened. The Japanese voices were distant now. They hadn't pursued. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud on the stock. Water still dripping from the barrel. 2 rounds remaining. No stripper clips. The clips were in his pack, somewhere near the water-filled crater. At 10:47 a.m., George began moving again. Not running, walking, staying low, using terrain for cover. He moved northeast toward American lines. The jungle was quiet. No voices, no movement. Just the sound of his own, breathing and distant artillery rumble. At 11:13 a.m., George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself. The sentry led him through. George walked to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full debrief. George provided it. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers. 11 hits. Then a firefight with infantry. 3 more kills. 5 total rounds in that engagement. Morris asked about ammunition status. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris asked about the rifle. George said it was functional but needed cleaning. Mud in the action. water in the barrel. Morris told George to clean his rifle and rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. Intelligence suggested they'd complete the withdrawal within 2 weeks. George returned to his tent and field stripped the Winchester, spending 2 hours cleaning every component. Cosmoline and gun oil. Patches run through the barrel until they came out clean. He checked scope mounts, adjusted eye relief, loaded 5 fresh rounds. At 2:00 p.m., word came from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see George. George walked to headquarters, wondering if Morris had filed a negative report. Unauthorized engagement, excessive ammunition expenditure, operating alone without support. Instead, he found Morris and 2 other officers waiting. One was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had one question. Could George train other men to do what he'd done? George said he could try, but it would require time, rifles with optics, and men who could already shoot. Ferry said division had 14 Springfield rifles with unorthodox scopes, sniper rifles left behind by Marines. Ferry had 40 men in the regiment who'd qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted George to create a sniper section, train the men, develop tactics, clear any remaining Japanese snipers from American operational areas. George accepted, but he had one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved the request. This civilian hunting rifle had just changed American military doctrine. But the story doesn't end here. George kept his Winchester Model 70. The 14 Springfield rifles with unorthodox scopes went to the men George would train. Training began January 27th. George had 40 men assembled at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. The men were expert marksmen on paper, qualified with iron sights at ranges up to 500 yards. But none had combat experience as snipers. None had killed a man from concealment. George started with fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind. The Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds with unorthodox scopes, heavier than the Garand, heavier than George's Winchester. The weight made them stable, but exhausting to hold for extended periods. George taught them to use any available support: rocks, logs, sandbags. The jungle rarely offered perfect shooting positions. Snipers had to adapt to terrain and create stable platforms from whatever materials were available. Range training lasted 3 days. George had the men engage stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then moving targets, then targets partially concealed by vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams: shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand. His job was locating targets and providing security while the shooter engaged. After each kill, roles could switch, keeping both men proficient and preventing single point of failure. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission: clear Japanese positions west of the Matnikau River. Intelligence indicated small groups of Japanese soldiers were still operating in that area. Not snipers, just infantry stragglers who hadn't yet evacuated. The 4 teams moved into position at dawn. George paired with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. They established position on high ground overlooking a trail the Japanese had been using for resupply. At 7:20 a.m., a Japanese soldier appeared on the trail. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt and scanned for additional targets. None appeared. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more Japanese soldiers on that trail. 7 shots, 6 kills, 1 miss due to wind. The other 3 teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day. 0 American casualties. The sniper section continued operations through early February. By February 9th, the section had 74 confirmed kills, conservative count, only including bodies that could be observed. The Japanese evacuation accelerated during this period. Destroyers arrived nightly to extract troops from Cape Esperance on Guadalcanal's western tip. American forces pushed west to interdict the evacuation, but the Japanese fought effective rearguard actions. George's sniper section was tasked with eliminating Japanese soldiers covering the retreat routes. On February 7th, George was operating near the Tanamba River when a Japanese rifleman shot him. The bullet struck George in the left shoulder. The impact spun him around and knocked him down. Hayes dragged George to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious, but not fatal. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors cleaned the wound and sutured it closed. They told George he'd recover, but needed rest. No combat operations for at least 3 weeks. George spent 2 weeks at the field hospital. During that time, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days. 74 confirmed kills. 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. The section was officially recognized by division headquarters. Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star. But George's war wasn't finished. While recovering at the field hospital, orders came from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a new mission. Something in Burma, something classified. George volunteered. By March, George was on a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold, the Lyman Alaskan scope wrapped in oilcloth. George didn't know the details of the Burma mission. He only knew it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, operations behind Japanese lines. The kind of mission where a man with a rifle that could hit targets at 600 yards might prove useful. The transport reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were briefed on their assignment. They would join a new unit, 3,000 men total. The unit had no official designation yet. The men called themselves something else. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. If this story captivated you, like it captivated us, do us a favor. Hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about riflemen who proved themselves with skill and courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. United States? United Kingdom? Canada? Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure John George doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.